All right, let's get started with another deep dive. Ready to explore some fun English vocab?
Yeah, sounds good.
Cool. We'll be looking at words and phrases you can use to talk about swimming. We've got this great English learning podcast that we're using as our source material.
Oh, nice.
So picture this. Beautiful sunny day, you're ready for a swim.
Perfect.
Let's dive into the language of the water.
I like it.
Okay, so this podcast, it starts off with these two friends. They're out on a sailboat.
Mm-hmm.
And right away, they use the word sailing.
Classic.
Just traveling on a boat powered by the wind. Pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
But then they mention the anchor.
Ah, yes.
That heavy thing you drop to keep the boat in place.
Keeps you from drifting away.
Exactly. And the podcast points out something kind of funny about anchor.
What's that?
The pronunciation. It's not anchor,
Right.
like you might think from the spelling.
It can be tricky. English pronunciation,
Definitely keeps things interesting, though.
for sure.
Okay, so back to our friends on the sailboat. One of them decides to jump in for a swim,
This sounds refreshing.
and they use some cool verbs to describe different swimming styles.
Oh, like what?
Well, first up, there's doggy paddling,
Ah, the classic.
kind of like what it sounds like,
Yeah, lots of splashing, trying to stay afloat.
More of a beginner move, probably.
Definitely paints a funny picture in your head.
Totally. Then they move on to breaststroke.
Bit more advanced.
Yeah, more coordinated. The podcast described it as this frog-like motion with your arms circling out and your legs kicking back at the same time.
Sounds about right. Efficient and popular.
And finally, we have backstroke.
Ah, nice and relaxing.
Exactly. Lying on your back, kicking your legs, circling those arms,
Perfect for a leisurely swim.
just enjoying the sky, taking it easy.
I like how the podcast didn't just give us definitions, though.
Oh, yeah, they actually use these words in real conversation, right?
Yeah.
Like they said, take a dip at one point.
Right, which is a much more casual way of saying, go for a quick swim.
It is. Simple and natural.
Much more like how people really talk.
Definitely. They also use the phrase for a little while to talk about how long they'd be swimming.
Super useful expression, works in all kinds of situations.
It does. Read for a little while, chat for a little while.
It's a good one to remember.
Absolutely. And you know what else they said? Straight towards.
Oh, yeah, when one of the friends swam toward the shore.
Directly towards it.
Shows a sense of purpose, intention.
They even gave this funny example. Something about heading straight towards the fridge after work.
Classic.
I mean, who hasn't done that?
Definitely relatable, but straight towards can be about more than just physical direction too, right?
Totally. Like you could say, I'm working straight towards my goals. Adds that extra determination, focus.
For sure.
But, the podcast also showed us how not paying attention to where you're headed,
Uh-oh.
well, can lead to some problems.
They had that story about the boating mishap, didn't they?
Yep, with the grandfather.
Not a good situation.
Definitely highlighted the importance of being aware, especially around water.
Always good to be careful.
Makes you wonder, have you ever had any, interesting or funny experiences around water?
Interesting. Yeah, I've had a few.
Oh.
One time I was out in a canoe
Okay.
and there was this really, really determined squirrel.
Uh-oh.
Let's just say it ended with me in the water.
I bet.
Yeah,
We'll have to hear more about that later.
definitely.
But back to the podcast for a sec.
Okay.
I thought it was cool how they used that story, the one about the grandfather,
Yeah.
to show us how language can be about more than just the dictionary definition of a word.
Oh, I see what you mean.
They were talking about doggy paddle, right?
Mm-hmm.
But they also got across this feeling of someone who's not that great at swimming, maybe even a little bit clumsy.
Yeah, it's different from saying someone swims with grace or power.
Totally.
Mm-hmm.
And it made me think about other words we use for water.
Like what?
Like dipping your toes in the pool.
Right.
Compared to, say, plunging into the ocean.
Two very different images.
Exactly. Dipping sounds gentle, tentative.
Whereas plunging is more bold, maybe even a bit scary.
Yeah, and that's what's so cool about listening to real English,
You pick up on those nuances.
It's not just about memorizing definitions.
Exactly. And the more you listen, the more you start to understand how native speakers use language.
Not just how it's explained in a textbook.
Totally. And as you're learning new words, don't be afraid to experiment.
Oh, good point.
Try different words, see what feels right.
Play around with it.
Yeah, it's like trying on different clothes.
Oh, I like that.
Some will fit better than others.
Some will express you better.
Exactly. You want to find the words that help you communicate, what you really mean and how you feel.
That's the power of language, right?
It is. It's constantly evolving, always finding new ways to be more precise, more nuanced.
And speaking of nuance, there's something else I noticed in the podcast.
Yeah.
They talked about doggy paddle, but they
They
also...
also got across this idea that doggy paddle kind of implies you're not a very skilled swimmer.
Right, like it's almost a little bit funny.
Yeah, definitely not the same as swimming with grace or power.
Hmm?
And it made me think about other words we use to talk about water.
Ooh, like what?
Well, think about the difference between dipping your toes in a pool and plunging into the ocean.
Two very different feelings there.
For sure. Dipping sounds really gentle, tentative, like you're just testing the waters.
Whereas plunging is more, I don't know, it sounds a lot bolder, maybe even a little bit scary.
Exactly. And that's what I think is so cool about listening to authentic English. You start to understand how native speakers actually use these words.
Yeah, how they use them to create a feeling or an image. It's not just about knowing the dictionary definition.
Right. Exactly. And, as you learn new words, I think it's important to experiment.
Oh, that's a good point.
Try using different words. See how they feel, how they sound. Don't be afraid to play around with the language a little bit.
It's like trying on clothes.
Yeah.
Right? Some are going to fit better than others.
Yeah. You want to find the clothes that help you express yourself. And it's the same with language.
You want the words that communicate exactly what you mean and how you feel.
Exactly. That's the power of language. It's constantly changing, always trying to find more precise ways to express ourselves, more nuanced ways.
I like that. It makes me think about how words can really shape how we see the world.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, if we use different words to describe something, would we actually experience it differently too?
That's a great question. I think the words we choose definitely influence our perceptions, our emotions.
Right. Like, think about it this way. What if instead of saying you dipped your toes in the water, you said you tumbled in?
Ooh, yeah. That paints a whole different picture.
Tumbled sounds more accidental, maybe even a bit chaotic. Right?
Totally. While dipped feels more intentional and controlled. So yeah, I do think the words we choose matter. And as you keep learning English, I encourage you to pay attention to those subtle differences in meaning, those little nuances that can really change the feeling of what you're saying.
It's like having a whole set of colors to paint with instead of just black and white.
Exactly. And speaking of painting a picture with words, think about this. How would you describe the sounds you hear when you're swimming? Is it the gentle lapping of waves on the shore or the rhythmic splash of your strokes?
Yeah. And how would you describe how the water feels against your skin? Is it smooth and silky, or is it more like cool and refreshing, maybe even a little bit rough and choppy?
Exactly. There are so many different ways to talk about the experience of being in the water. And as you build your swimming vocabulary, I encourage you to think about all of those details. It's not just about learning the words themselves, It's about using those words to create a vivid experience for your listener.
That's a perfect note to end on. We've explored so many cool words and phrases related to swimming, and I hope our listeners feel inspired to keep diving deeper into the language, to keep discovering new ways to express themselves.
That's what it's all about.